What up, though? Breaking news. The Pittsburgh Press newspaper, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Monday, September 29th, 1890. 1890. 1890 is like yesterday. If anyone puts any time into learning where they come from, the Pittsburgh Press newspaper, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Monday, September 29th, 1890. Romantic and woolly. A Mexican cowboy weds a German beauty. She was attracted by a show poster depicting him riding a wild steer. A Mexican cowboy. What do you know about Mexicans? Are Mexicans just the people who occupy or are the inhabitants of the soil portion that we term as Mexico because of our lines on a map? New York, September 29th. Many romantic stories have been written from time to time of the historical Wild West. But the most romantic of all is, perhaps, the story of the marriage of pretty Babette Slanderson with Joe Castello, a Mexican bronco and wild steer rider who has been performing for nearly 2 years with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Castello, or Castello, landed here with his fair young bride 2 weeks ago in company with 3 Indian chiefs from the same show. Joe would certainly never attract attention from the aristocratic mold of his face, although he claims to belong to a noble Mexican family. Now, when the newspapers are speaking of Mexican, they may very well be speaking of the indigenous people from that soil portion that we now call Mexico. But as you know, Mexico, Central America, South America, Canada, and where we are, what is termed North America, are all the Americas, including the islands of Haiti, Jamaica, Bahamas, and the like. Joe would certainly never attract attention from the aristocratic mold of his face, although he claims to belong to a noble Mexican family. They're saying by his face, by his appearance alone, he would never attract attention from the aristocratic mold of his face. He would never attract attention based on his appearance, although he claims to belong to a noble Mexican family. Joe is of a very dark brown complexion. How many Mexicans do you know that are of a very dark brown complexion? I'm not talking about tanned. Most people call Mexicans brown people because they are tanned. They are pale and tanned. No. Right now, we speaking of what seems to be the indigenous Mexicans or the American Indians, the ones from the place we call Mexico, the ones that today are falsely labeled Afro-Mexicans. Let's shake it. Joe is of a very dark brown complexion with an enormous mouth flat nose, piercing black eyes, and an almost ferocious expression of countenance. His bride is a short, plump, and pronounced blonde of an unmistakable German cast of features. She is highly accomplished, speaking French, German, Italian, and Spanish fluently. She is also an accomplished musician and painter. Her husband's accomplishments are confined to speaking pure Castilian Spanish and having the proud distinction of being one of the few living men who ever rode a wild Texan steer without saddle or bridle. So it seems to me his accomplishments are much greater than hers. His are based in practicality. Hers are based in theology. The story of their courtship is highly romantic. The beautiful Babette, although they said she was chunky and this and that, but they also said she was fair. So I guess that's where her beauty stems from. She is fair, or at least to the author of this article in the Pittsburgh Press newspaper in 1890. The year that countless numbers of archives were burned, or the offices were burned and the records were never to be recovered again. The beautiful Babette, who is the daughter of a wealthy merchant in Ablach, a small German town a few miles from Munich, was attracted by the glittering posters and other bills announcing the arrival of the Wild West show in Munich. She was particularly struck with the prowess of the gallant Joe, who was depicted as on a bull who was attempting to turn a forward somersault or stand on his head, for the animal's intention was not clearly stated in the bills, while the gallant Joe waved his sombrero to an immense gallery of spectators who were in evening dress at the outdoor performance. Babette made up her mind that Joe was the man of her choice, and leaving home went to Munich, where she saw her idol astride of the animated beef. She wanted Joe purely based on his accomplishments and his skill. She waved her handkerchief, smiled, threw bouquets, and finally kissed her hand to the gallant cowboy, who at once was smitten with the love which gleamed from the fair one's eyes. He returned the affection, and his lady love followed the show from town to town until Joe got orders to sail from Hamburg in charge of the 3 Indian chiefs. It seems as though she was stalking him. And Joe was with Indian chiefs. Okay. Why would 3 Indian chiefs be hanging with the dark brown, wide-mouthed, wide-eyed Joe? Because he was also an Indian. Then she declared her passion to the smitten Joseph and told him that if he would not wed her, she would elope to America with him. Joe did the proper thing like a gallant knight and wedded the lady, doubtless to prevent any interference on the part of her family. The nuptials were celebrated with all the wild, weird grandeur of a cowboy's wedding or an Indian's wedding. Buffalo Bill, in top boots, gave the bride away. Red Cloud, No Neck, Kills 2 Men, Prairie Jack, and a host of other celebrities being present. There was a grand feast in the teepees of the Indians, and the cowboys behaved in their best traditional manner. The fair bride wrote to her parents, and after some delay, the old gentleman relented and sent her a draft for 3,000 marks on July 1st, but did not send her her wardrobe. As love laughs at prison bars, so a little matter did not trouble the fair bride, who embarked with her faithful Joe for this country. Big inroads had been made into the bride's dowry, and as Joe had not been able to accumulate much wealth from his salary of $1 per day, the couple have for the last 10 days been anxiously looking for a further remittance from the lady's parents. Joe declines to say where he resides in this city, and his young wife has sought the advice of General Byrne at the barge office as to the best means of getting to San Antonio, Texas, where the bull rider has a home, and for getting a trousseau, which she badly needs. Just in, a special report. The McHenry Plain Dealer newspaper, McHenry, Illinois, Wednesday, September 17th, 1890. The McHenry Plain Dealer newspaper, September 17th, 1890. The big man who showed off. At Fargo, we got news of an accident on the line beyond, and the train had to wait there for 2 hours. Everybody got out to stroll around, and there were a good many people at the depot to look the passengers over. So it's a group of people that's just looking at passengers on the train. They people watching. Among these, we had our attention attracted to a big man who had on a buffalo overcoat, a wolfskin cap, and from the collar of the coat dangled 7 or 8 claws, which had once assisted grizzly bears to scratch their way through life. He had long hair, a wild eye, buckskin leggings, and was evidently a mighty Nimrod. If you don't know what Nimrod means, you should look up Nimrod. It'll add more substance to the article. He was walking up and down the platform to show himself off when an undersized, insignificant-looking passenger on our train, who had been dubbed Godfrey's Cordial ever since we left Chicago, approached him and asked, "Mr. Man, is that overcoat for sale?" "No, sir," was the thunderous response as the wearer of it turned on the questioner. "Oh, excuse me. I see you have some claws there. Did they belong to a cat?" "Cat? Cat? Did you ever see a cat with such claws?" "No, sir. And that's the reason I asked you. Is that cat made of lambskin?" "Lambskin? What are you driving at?" "My dear sir, I never drive. It's against my principles. I am simply dealing solid facts. Why don't you have your hair cut and put on them woolen pantaloons? I should think you would catch cold." He on him, ain't he? "Look here," growled the big man as he came to a halt. "I want you to go away." "Do I make you tired?" "You do." "I am though sorry. Now you clear out or I'll get mad. Real mad. You hear me? I should like to buy one of those claws. I'll give you 2 shillings for, if you don't clear out, I'll slice an ear off." "Would you really slice my ear off?" innocently asked Cordial. "I would and I will." "Which ear?" "Both of 'em, you infernal fool." "They," said Cordial after looking him over, "I don't like the way you talk. I think you ought to apologize." "Apologize? Why, you grasshopper, I've a good mind to hold you up by the hair." "Don't you try it, but I will." And he did. But he had scarcely reached out when Cordial was all chain lightning and fish bones and pounded glass. He jumped in with his left on the big man's nose, took him on the mouth with his right as he fell, and the buffalo overcoat had no sooner hit the platform than the little man was swarming all over it with both fists working like piston rods. In 1 minute, the big man was licked, and then he was led off one way while we took cordial the other. I don't know what old Bear's Claws had to say, but as we got the little fellow into the coach, he retied the bow at his collar, dusted his shoes with his handkerchief, and explained, "Without a blame, when I thought those claws wasn't it natural that I should wonder where the cat was? And I never saw a wolf nor a buffalo in my life, in my whole life." The New York Sun. The McHenry Plain Dealer, McHenry, Illinois. The McHenry Plain Dealer newspaper, Wednesday, September 17th, 1890. British forts threaten. Line of fortifications from Halifax to South America. There is no parallel in history to the manner in which the friendly nation, Great Britain, is multiplying and strengthening fortifications in front of our face in such a manner that she may best hem us in, bombard us, and interfere with our commerce if occasion should arise. Says a correspondent of the New York Times, from Halifax to the coast of South America, she has a line drawn in front of us, in some instances directly in our face, and in no case more than 500 miles from our shore. She has our entire Atlantic coast guarded, and every year she is extending and strengthening her works at almost every point. If the Bermuda Cable had been laid and had been in British hands in 1860 instead of 1890, what would have been the effect upon our blockade? This offensive line, for I can hardly regard it as a defensive line, is maintained at almost fabulous expense, and there is a reason for its existence. From our own northern frontier, everything except Alaska and 2 insignificant French islands is British to the North Pole, 3,500,000 square miles of it in Canada alone, their frontier touching ours, theirs fortified and the fortifications manned. Towering over our northeastern corner are the 2 sections of Canada known as New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and a little further off is the separate colony of Newfoundland. With its 42,000 square miles of territory, a big black woolly dog guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, bristling with forts, bright with the red coats of British soldiers. Directly south of Nova Scotia, about 900 miles from it and 500 miles off the coast of North Carolina, is Bermuda, a young Gibraltar, fortified almost to the utmost limit, with unapproachable harbors and a strong garrison. These 2 places, 48 hours apart by modern war vessels, are connected by telegraph, so that a vessel leaving the port midday between them for New York could be intercepted from either point before she fairly got to sea. Only 300 miles south of Bermuda, the Bahamas, a chain of islands 400 miles long, some of them within 100 miles of the Florida coast, the principal one fortified and garrisoned. Next, south of Bahamas, Jamaica, with its 4,000 square miles and its 600,000 inhabitants, its forts, its naval station, and its telegraph. Then, in the northern part of Central America, is British Honduras, with its 10,000 square miles and 30,000 inhabitants. With the Bahamas fortified by Great Britain, nothing could pass between Cuba and Key West, and the naval stations at Jamaica and Belize could easily prevent any vessel from entering the Gulf through the Yucatan Channel. The entire Gulf of Mexico could thus be blockaded with ease by 2 or 3 good vessels, and New Orleans, Mobile, and all our Gulf ports sealed up. Here is our whole Atlantic coast, from the northernmost corner of Maine to Brownsville, Texas, effectually guarded by the ships of a friendly nation, everything arriving at or leaving the great port of New York at the mercy of vessels sent out from Halifax or Bermuda, and New Orleans, Key West, and all the Gulf ports ready to be shut into order. But although she does not contemplate coming over here to make war upon us, she does appreciate the fact that there may, at some future day, be trouble between the two nations, and she is taking care to be well prepared for it. Some Anglomaniacs may scout the idea of Great Britain's recognizing even the remote possibility of such a thing, but when a man once becomes an Anglomaniac, his judgment is likely to be warped in many respects. An Anglomaniac. Our main safety lies in the fact that the United States is not Cyprus, nor North Borneo, nor the Gold Coast, nor Fiji, nor yet Zululand, but a nation of 60 million people with money and arms and ability to use them. Just then, the McHenry Plain Dealer newspaper, McHenry, Illinois, Wednesday, September 17th, 1890. Killing a nigger. There were half a dozen of us at the railroad station at Erin, Tennessee, when an old man rode up on a mule at a slashing gallop and cried, "Some of you all lend me a gun or a pistol right quick." Naturally enough, we inquired what was the trouble, and he bobbed around on his saddle and replied, "I want to kill a nigger who has insulted me." None of us had a firearm, and after a few minutes the man cooled down considerably. Then I asked him how the nigger had insulted him, and he replied, "I was coming along to town, and I met a nigger whom I knowed. Says I, 'Nigger Joe, can you lend me $1? "Can't lend you no dollar, Marse George," he replied. "Why?" says I. "'Cause you done owe me $2 for a hullier, Marse George." "Can't lend you no dollar, Marse George," he replied. "Why?" says I. "'Cause you done owe me $2 for a whole year, Marse George. Think of it, stranger. Think of a nigger done in a white man, right in broad daylight. Think of his refusing me $1 when he knows I'm good for 10,000. Why, sir, I ought to kill him. I really had. I ought to ride back and choke him to death. Why you ain't do it while you was in front of him?" I got a pretty good idea. It must make your blood boil. Blood? Why? Why, sir, I'm on fire. I've got to kill him. Got to do it. And by the way, if you could lend me $50 to buy powder and buckshot, I know where I can borrow a gun. You must realize how necessary it is to kill that nigger. I let him have the money, and he rode off about 300 feet, hitched his mule, and slid into a saloon. And a little later, we could hear him pounding on a table and shouting, "Some more of that liquor, Sam. It's my bounden duty to kill that nigger." And going to do it. New York Sun. Yeah, he was going to do it in his dreams. I don't know if he was even going to make it out of the saloon. News update. The News of Cumberland County, Bridgeton, New Jersey newspaper, Wednesday, March 19th, 1890. These are some of the things that was happening in 1890. I know within the last 10, 20 years, we haven't really seen newspapers. And even when we saw newspapers, we always knew that we could only believe a tiny fraction of what was in the newspapers. But in 1890, yeah, the hijack was strong. Yeah, the hijack was stewed to a fine broth. Mwah. But I'm sure the fraction of truth was a tad bit larger than it was in the recent past. The News of Cumberland County newspaper, Bridgeton, New Jersey, Wednesday, March 19th, 1890. Humpty Dumpty. I suppose you will think that was not her true name, but it was. She was a little colored girl. In 1890, do you know what a little colored girl was in 1890? Yeah, a little Indian girl. A slave, too, of course. Of course, a slave. Born a slave. A 3-month-old baby is born a slave. You know why? Because they were considered dependents. You know, when Anglo-Saxons came over with all they writing and shit, anyone in the home who wasn't the head of the household or the husbandman, were considered his dependents. And dependents were considered slaves because they labored for the head of the household, or properly, they worked for themselves. They worked with nature. I suppose you will think we're talking about Humpty Dumpty here. You know, maybe some of y'all know the child song of Humpty Dumpty, but we're talking about Humpty Dumpty before that. Humpty Dumpty, the News of Cumberland County, Bridgeton, New Jersey newspaper. Humpty Dumpty. I suppose you will think that was not her true name, but it was. She was a little colored girl, a little American Indian girl, a little American girl, a slave too, but she had a good master and mistress, or possibly, which seems to run rampant with the Anglo-Saxon, with the foreigner, is child trafficking. She was a little colored girl, a slave too, but she had a good master and mistress who never ill-treated those who were dependent on them, but did all they could to make them happy. When the baby opened its eyes upon this world, her parents were much exercised over a name for her. But before it was settled, it became only too certain that the poor little creature, and we all know that white means creature, okay? Not the little Indian girl, not the little colored girl. The poor little creature was doomed to pass through life in sad deformity. The dark, curly head settled down too far on the shoulders, and the back arched behind it. "Oh," exclaimed Harry Farley, the first time he saw the baby. Why, mama, she's a regular Humpty Dumpty, isn't she?" "What's that, Massa Harry? What's that, Humpty Dumpty?" cried Aunt Dina, her ear caught by the new name. "Humpty Dumpty on the wall, Humpty Dumpty got a fall," quoted Harry, and that ended the search for a nice big name for the little stranger. And so Humpty, as they called her, became a recognized member of the household, and by no means a useless one as she grew older. Humpty was more thought young as she is than all the rest of the slaves put together. Miss Farley used to say, and it was true. Humpty's master lived in Georgia on a large plantation where cotton and sugarcane grew in great luxuriance. He had a large number of slaves whose neat little houses were scattered all over the plantation, each one with its own garden plot. See? Get rid of all your preconceived notions. He had a large number of slaves. You have no idea what he's complexion is. He had a large number of slaves, employees, workers, whose neat little houses, not shacks, neat little houses were scattered all over the plantation. No one told you who built those neat little houses. Scattered all over the plantation, each one with its own garden plot. The Farleys had a beautiful home, plenty of money, and love and peace among themselves. So they ought to have been happy, you would think. And so they were, as far as these things went. But overall, there was a cloud, a tiny one at first, but it kept on growing bigger and bigger, causing Mr. Fairley, I think that's his name, Fairley, Mr. Fairley's many an hour of the sharpest anxiety, until by the time Humpty was 14 years old, the sky darkened, the thunder began to mutter, and the long looked for storm broke forth. The long looked for storm broke forth. Mr. Fairley's home, which had been his father's and grandfather's before him, was not far from the Florida line. So it's Georgia and the Florida line. Somewhere around the Seminole River, perhaps. Forthcoming. And the Indian village of Miccosukee. Mr. Fairley's home, which had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, was not far from the Florida line. And the Indian village of Miccosukee was only a few miles on the other side. Florida was then a Spanish province, though the Spanish commanders had no power outside their fortified post, and in the interior, the Seminole Indians, who, as their name indicates, were runaways from the Creek Nation, held full sway. The Red Stick tribe of the Miccosukee village were their allies and were called Red Stick because in the center of the village stood a tall pole painted red to denote the warrior's thirst for the blood of the pale faces. And on it were many hundreds of pale-faced scalps. It says of American scalps, so it could have been other Indian scalps. But from my experience in these articles, when they speak of Americans, they tend to mean Anglo-Saxons, foreigners. But for the sake of the article, let's read what it says. And let's stick to what it says. Let's stick to what the words say. To denote the warrior's thirst for the blood of the pale faces, and on it were many hundreds of American scalps. Besides these hostile Indians, there were hundreds of runaway slaves and escaped convicts roaming at will over the beautiful Florida wilderness, ready at all times to join the Indians in robbing and murdering Americans. See, the Americans are synonymous, I believe, with Anglo-Saxons here, with foreigners here. But as we know, America is the soil. So the real Americans are the Indians. And it says, besides these hostile Indians, there were hundreds of runaway slaves, runaway workers who broke their contracts, who broke their applications of employment, and escaped convicts who were picked up and being turned into free slave labor, free workers, indefinitely, roaming at will over the beautiful Florida wilderness, ready at all times to join the Indians. Why? Because they were also Indians, in robbing and murdering Americans, who they seem to make synonymous with Anglo-Saxons or foreigners from Afro-Eurasia. They spared the Spaniards because the Spanish authorities in Florida encouraged their lawless acts. So, as you may believe, things were bad enough at all times, but now they were growing worse, and the Indians had declared war. For months past, Mr. Fairley's anxiety had been intense, and again he had urged his wife to abandon their home until peace should be restored. But Mrs. Fairley loved her home and was not willing to leave it, so kept putting off her departure. And I don't want to assume, but how many of you think that Mr. and Mrs. Fairley are Anglo-Saxons or foreigners or Afro-Eurasians? Or how many of you think that Mr. and Mrs. Fairley's are Indians, aka Black Americans, African Americans? The day came, however, late in March 1816, when her husband came riding home from the town 20 miles away at breakneck speed, his face white and drawn with intense excitement. You have your answer. He rode straight to the stables, called the slaves together, and bade them harness. Wait. At breakneck speed, his face white and drawn with intense excitement, he rode straight to the stables, called the slaves together, and bade them harness all the horses and mules to the wagons. Then he came to the house and loaded up all the most valuable furniture. Be quick, he ordered. The red sticks are out pillaging and murdering. We must get off as fast as possible. There, don't wail or moan. Work with all your might. That will do more good than howling. Then he dashed into the house, and in a moment more, all there was bustle and confusion and rapid, energetic action. In less than 3 hours, the plantation was deserted, and its whole population well on the road towards a place of safety. Very interesting. When you read these articles, it seems that it's unlike a job today. It's a tad bit similar, but it seems as though you were expected to kind of help management or help the CEO, even when they were facing violence. It's not much different today. Think about it. You could have a unarmed security guard, and it could be a nigga, and you got a Arab store owner, and in some instances, if someone steals something, like in The Wire when what's his name, when Marlo stole a lollipop and the unarmed security guard nigga put his life on the line, actually gave his life for that lollipop and for his Arab boss or massa. But of course, when the flight had been so hasty, some important things had been forgotten. And so a week later, hearing that the Indians had left that part of the frontier for the time, Mr. Fairley decided to return to the plantation for a few days, taking with him E Pluribus Salis, for thus had Humpty's parents named her elder brother, acting on the advice of mischievous Harry, a sturdy youth of 18, and Humpty to cook for them. For young as she was, she had learned a great deal of this difficult art. The little colored girl, Humpty, had learned a great deal of the art of cooking at her young age. And her brother, 18, his name was E Pluribus Salis. There was much to do to prepare for a long absence, so the three were very busy, and every little while Humpty, who of course felt very anxious, crept out upon the roof to look for signs of the enemy. See, the enemy, the Indians become their enemy. The enemy of the boss becomes the enemy of the employees as well. And at last, on the second day, quite early in the morning, her heart gave a great leap as she saw over the treetops a column of smoke rising skyward. She knew that only one thing could make such a smoke in the particular spot, a burning house, that of their nearest neighbor 2 miles away. And she was equally sure that the Indians were there robbing and burning, and only not murdering because the family had deserted their home. Humpty was only a little girl, only a little Negro hunchback. The sight and the shock overcame her. Head over heels like a ball, she rolled down the ladder that led to the roof and lay on the floor screaming at the top of her voice. Only for a moment, though. Then she stopped, caught her breath, doubled up her fist, and pummeled herself unmercifully. "You, Humpty, you miserable critter," she cried indignantly. "Get right up and run and tell Massa and Salis. There now, stop yelling and get up quick. Mean, miserable little nigger, you. Pears like you ought to be scalped, but don't want to, no how. Oh, Lord." Panting and breathless, little Humpty rushed across the fields to Mr. Fairley and her brother, and in a few moments all three were running back to the house. But before they had gone halfway, a shot, another and another from out the young forest, warned them that their foes were already upon them. They were close to an old log cabin, once used as a smokehouse for curing bacon. Bacon. It had a great chimney. Bacon. It had a great chimney built of clay and sticks, running up on the outside, and on the inside a large fireplace and 2 rooms. Since the new troubles with the Indians, Mr. Fairley had repaired the old cabin and built a high, strong picket fence around it, intending, if he was so unfortunate as to be surprised by the enemy, to take refuge there until help could come from the settlement. In the cabin was a keg of powder, a good store of bullets, and several rifles, beside a keg of water and some provisions, for he had thought it all out and prepared for a short siege, if needs must. The bullets rattled against the picket fence as the three fugitives rushed through the gates and barred it behind them. E pluribus salus, with his teeth chattering and smarting under the reproaches of his sister as a mean, miserable nigger, feared of Injuns, yet managed. Do the right thing.